Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Donna, for that wonderful introduction. It is my absolute pleasure to be here. And indeed, the days and the evenings that I get to speak about bees to enthusiastic environmental stewards like all of yourselves are my favorite days, even when it's dark in the middle of dark winter. Tonight, I want to introduce you to this sort of secret world of wild bees, much of which exists in plain sight in our backyards. And I would hope to give you the language and the tools tonight to sort of see and visit this world for yourselves. I think when most of us think of bees, we think of the European honeybee, these wonderful ladies. They live in big hives headed by a single queen, and the hive contains anywhere from 10 to 30,000 daughter workers. And these bees take on a variety of tasks. Some of them guard, others go out to forage. They come back to the hive and they store honey, which is sort of dehydrated nectar. And whether we like honeybees for the food, the crops they pollinate, or the nectar they produce, I think honeybees have captured the general public's imagination. And this is partly because about 90% of wild plants require animal pollination. And of those, about 75% of our top global crops require pollination. And we need animal pollinators precisely because of so many of our crops require an animal to produce fruit. Pollination is essentially the transfer of pollen from the male part of the flower, which are the anthers, to the female part of the flower, which is the stigma. And although we often say, bees are pollinators, they actually don't know they're pollinators. A bee is a bee. A bee is trying to gather food. And so a bee visits a flower for a nectar reward. That's a sugary substance, a little bit of electrolytes. Think of it sort of like bee Gatorade. And a bee also gathers some of that pollen, which is protein rich to eat. So a bee visits a flower, gathers some nectar, gathers some pollen, and in the process of visiting another flower to pack up on groceries, some of that pollen gets knocked off and pollination occurs. In a world with fewer bees, we would have less to eat, which is why the plight of the honeybee has sort of skyrocketed in the public's concern and was really picked up by the media. In around 2006, reports of colony collapse disorder, which was a phenomenon where, over the course of a week, an entire colony of about 30,000 bees would dwindle to only a few thousand, and the hive would die shortly thereafter. And although colony collapse disorder isn't an issue anymore, concern for honeybees still is pervasive. Unfortunately, we don't need to worry about the honeybee as much as folks would like us to believe. The honeybee is an exotic bee. It comes from Europe. It was introduced to North America in the 1600s. And although they are the only bee in the US that makes honey, they are not historic members of our environmental and biodiversity communities. Honeybees, although they face their own diseases, they can be replicated and grown in the lab. And I like to think of efforts to save the environment by raising honeybees akin to efforts to save songbirds by raising backyard chickens. We can think of the honeybee as an agricultural livestock. They're really important for conventional agriculture at the scale at which we grow orchards of almonds or orchards of apples. But they are not an environmental concern. Instead, the bees we do need to care about are our native bees. The more than 4,000 species of bees that don't live in boxes stewarded by beekeepers, but rather live in our wild places. The bees that come in every size, shape, and color you can imagine. There are green bees, there are blue bees, there are orange bees. There are bees smaller than orzo. There are bees bigger than rigatoni. There are bees with antennae longer than their body. Unlike the honeybee, these bees are far less well known to people, and yet they are super pollinators. They've co-evolved with many of the crops that we eat, such as cranberries or blueberries, and as a result, exceed the honeybee in pollinating capacities. Unfortunately, many of these native bees are at risk. One bee that sort of has emerged as the poster child of bee conservation is the rusty-patched bumblebee, Bombus affinis. Now, I grew up in New England, in Southern Connecticut, and I remember we would eat cranberry sauce, one of my favorite Thanksgiving condiments and sides. And many of us will get cranberries from ocean spray or cranberries that were grown in New England, in the cranberry fields of Cape Cod, Plymouth County in Massachusetts. And if, growing up in the 90s, if I were to eat cranberry sauce grown in New England, the rusty-patched bumblebee was a pollinator of those cranberries. Cranberries depend on bumblebees for pollination.
Mm-hmm.
Starting in around 2005, fewer and fewer rusty-patched bumblebees were found in New England. And in just a few years, the numbers dramatically plummeted, and its range contracted almost 90%. The rusty-patched bumblebee is no longer found in Massachusetts. It's no longer found in Connecticut. In fact, it's no longer found east of Illinois, save for some isolated mountaintops in West Virginia. Now, the rusty-patched bumblebee is just one example, and there are many bumblebees that have actually increased in numbers in recent years. And we try to think about why the rusty-patched bumblebee declined so quickly.
Yes.
We can identify several threats that face bees as well as other insects and biodiversity at large. The big three are habitat loss, chemical and pesticide use, and climate change, particularly heat waves, as well as warmer winters. But in addition, it's pollution, invasive species, industrial agriculture, the prevalence of lawns. No single one of these threats is solely responsible for insect declines, but rather it's the synergy between these threats that scientists call death by 1,000 cuts. However, I'd like to introduce us to a threat that's not on this chart, which is actually the secret of those bees, which is that there's actually a lot we don't know about the basic biology and life cycle and natural history of many of our native pollinators. And if we hope to save them, I think it would do us good to learn a bit more about what their needs are, not just when they're visiting flowers, but throughout the rest of the year when they're hiding and developing. And so this is sort of the thesis for the talk, which is that in order to save our native bees, we need to know our native bees. I think a great place to start is, what is a bee? I think we all know that bees like flowers. But did you catch that this isn't a bee? This is actually a hoverfly mimicking the black and white coloration patterns of stinging bees and wasps. I know this is not a bee because it has two wings held out in a triangle, huge fly eyes that bulge and press into each other, and virtually non-existent antennae, just a little club at the front of the face. Many of us also know bees like to visit our picnics, but in fact, the bees that we see in our picnics aren't bees. These are yellow jacket wasps. Wasps are not very hairy, and while they do have slender eyes and longer antennae, wasps are scavengers, carnivores. They get protein from meat and other insects, whereas bees are essentially vegans. All of their diet comes from plants. So don't worry, the bees on our picnics are not actually bees. This actually is a bee. This is a sunflower longhorn bee, and she loves the pollen and nectar from sunflowers. In general, bees have 4 wings. They have long antennae, slender eyes, and they're often very fuzzy. And that enables them to carry pollen back to the nest. So my definition for a bee is actually a vegetarian wasp. And to understand why bees are not, arise from wasps, we have to go back to a time before there were flowers. It's about 130 million years ago, at the end of the middle of the Cretaceous period. This is the time of dinosaurs. It's also the time of spore-bearing plants like ferns. And flowers were a relatively recent innovation on planet Earth. And with this innovation came different sources of foods for insects, like thrips that like to chew the petals, the thick petals of flowers, and eat pollen. Now, there were already wasps. They're insects, and if there's an insect, there's a wasp that's going to eat it or parasitize it. And so there were lots of wasps that hunted different insects, including some of these flower-visiting thrips. And one of the leading hypotheses is that these wasps that ate thrips that visited flowers transitioned from an insect-based diet to a plant-based diet. This is a new niche that could be occupied by wasps, and instead of having adaptations that allowed them to slip through the air and catch an insect, they developed adaptations that will allow them to gather pollen. And from this this relatively small group of 20 species of wasps that hunted thrips, radiated out across planet Earth 20,000 species of bees that occupy virtually every terrestrial habitat containing flowers over the next 130 million years. So scientists estimate there's about 20,000 species of bees on planet Earth, about 4,000 in North America. In our slice of the world, it's about 400 to 500.
Did you go into the Zoom part?
Everywhere on a bee, you can see the result of this evolution alongside plants. So because bees are vegans and they depend on pollen for protein, they've developed adaptations for gathering pollen efficiently. Some of that means that they have long hairs on their legs, but even on the rest of their body, they have hairs that are branched. And this branching hair effectively increases the surface area of each hair and allows more grains of sticky pollen to be transported and effectively carry them back to the nest. So now that we're sort of on the same page of what a bee is, what do our native bees do, and how might learning what our native bees do allow us to steward our landscapes more effectively for them? I've broken it down into three components. Our native bees build nests, they visit flowers to gather food, and then they hibernate within those nests until their favorite flowers are out next year. Perhaps our best known wild bees are bumblebees. You can see them on virtually every flower throughout the growing season from May through October. And they're all around us. They're fuzzy. Often in New England, they have black and white, sort of black and light yellow patterning, like this common eastern bumblebee here. So it's spring. In a few weeks or so, the first queen bumblebees are going to emerge with warmer spring temperatures. And they are going to quickly refuel after their long 6-month hibernation underground. They're going to gather nectar to help build up their fat stores, and they're going to gather pollen, which helps them develop their ovaries and also helps them raise their first cohort or generation of daughters. The queen finds a cozy cavity beneath bunch grasses or beneath a stone wall, and she places some of that pollen and nectar and lays eggs in the nutritious loaf of bee bread, as they call it. Over the next 3 weeks, the eggs that she lays develop into workers, and the daughters of this queen commence gathering food, whereas the queen stays back in the nest to raise the next generation. You know the queen bumblebees are out because you can hear them before you see them. They're really loud, and they zoom low along the ground as they're looking for these nesting cavities. So keep your ears out this spring. By early June, the first workers are out and they're gathering pollen, and they visit all sorts of flowers, from cherries and spirea to clovers, indigos, and peas to bee balm. And although the bumblebees have very broad preferences for the flowers they like, within each species, some of them have long tongues and visit deeper flowers, whereas others have short tongues and visit shallow flowers. Bumblebees will store pollen and nectar in little orange or yellow pellets on their leg. And in order to be effective at gathering some of this pollen, they've developed a behavior known as sonication or buzz pollination. Flowers in the nightshade family, so tomatoes, chilies, tomatillos, as well as in the blueberry family, like well, blueberries, and cranberries require vibration in order to release that pollen. Think of it like a salt shaker with really tiny holes for those grains of salt to come out. If you just turn it out upside down slowly, no grains of salt might come out, but you have to shake it. And flowers respond to this shaking at a very particular frequency, between 200 and 400 hertz. Now, for the audiophiles in the room, some of you might know that that is in the range in which middle C is contained. And so some of our bumblebees and our native bees vibrate flowers at middle C, others at a G, others at a B, but in frequencies that we can hear. And this is the result of evolution between plants and our bees. Now, many of the plants that I named, like chilies and tomatoes and blueberries, are important crops. And so buzz pollination is an important part of the food system that we have. But honeybees can't buzz pollinate. And so this is one of the economic reasons for having a diverse suite of bees on our farms, is that we actually need behaviorally different kinds of bees in order to produce a good crop yield. In the fall, after the workers have gathered pollen, the hive has grown from one queen to maybe 50 or 60 workers. New queens and males, the reproductive individuals, are produced. The queens and males mate. The queens fuel up on goldenrods and asters. And then the males, the old colony and the old queen, die, and the new queens tuck underground for the coming winter. And from this, we learn that bumblebees don't just need flowers on the 4th of July, but the queens need flowers in early spring to fuel up after winter. They need a space to build her nest that she doesn't excavate. She needs a pre-existing cavity. They also need flowers throughout the entirety of the summer, from early June all the way through end of August. And then they need flowers again for those queens and males to fuel up for the queens to fuel up for the winter. And so thinking about this in a life cycle context makes it easier to make decisions about how we steward our landscape. We might decide that we like flowers of the 4th of July because of the bumblebees on those flowers. But we have to also remember that the bees are there precisely because they had everything they needed before the 4th of July, and they also have everything they needed after the 4th of July. So keeping bumblebees around is not just a matter of looking at the summer life stages, but also on the shoulder seasons. Bumblebees are a social bee, right? They live in colonies with a queen and workers. But in fact, most of our native bees don't live in societies like that. Most of our native bees are solitary, and they have a slightly different life cycle than the one I've just described. Because they live in a solitary life, they actually are much less likely to sting. Yeah, there's no queen, there's no honey that they've stored, there's no hive to defend. And so one of the reasons I love studying native bees is that it's actually a relatively safe activity. The bees that I study, I think I've been stung like 3 times in 7 years, and every single time it's been my fault because I was holding the bee trying to paint mark her so I could study where she was going to fly and learn secrets about her life that way. So as someone that studies bees all the time and interacts with them, I can say that it's actually a fairly safe activity. Most of our solitary bees live below ground. This lovely lady here is a cellophane bee. She is in the genus Calides, and they are about to emerge in New England right around the end of March. So I went to school up in the Boston area at Tufts University, and this is a picture of the Mystic Lakes, which is just about 2 miles north of campus. So I was eager a couple of years back. It was a warm, like 55, 60-degree day in mid-March, and I biked down to the Mystic Lakes. I pulled over at this sandy area. There's sort of red maples just about to bloom on the banks, and there was no activity. People were swimming, so clearly it was a warm day, but there weren't any bees out. But the very next day, it was also 60 degrees, and I biked down, and lo and behold, it was bee season. This adorable fluffy male had emerged and was sunning himself on a leaf. I know he's a male because of the long antennae that sort of hook around at the end and the thick yellow hairs on his face that look like a mustache. In fact, many male bees have, thick hairs on their face like that. But it wasn't just one. It was hordes of them. Hundreds of males were zooming around the ground. Each of these black dots in the video here is a male cellophane bee zooming around in the boundary layer where the scents of the different females have not quite dissipated in the spring air. And they're looking for females to mate with. This is an area about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, not very big, and yet highly concentrated. I'm sitting in the middle of it. Behind me are as many males as are in front of me. And this is also a thing about bees, is that male bees actually possess no stinger. And so I knew that this was an incredibly safe activity to just sit here for a nice, luxurious afternoon in the winter sun and watch bees. So a lucky male will find a female to mate with. Let's see if I can. A lucky male will find a female to mate with, and they mate just once. After that, the female is sick and tired of the male's monkey business, and the males don't help with anything. They just are a bother, and males will be kicked away with a swift kick of the mid-leg after the female has been mated. So the female then commences her incredible life's activities. She digs a deep tunnel 1 to 2 feet in the sandy soil, and she suns herself to get enough energy to fly. Bees are ectothermic. That means they don't produce their own body heat for the most part. And so you can think of them as solar powered. Like they can't fly if it's too cold. And so they sit in that entrance and they sun themselves to get enough energy to fly up into the trees. Now, as I said, if I see one male, I've often seen many, and the same is true for the females. They build these neighborhoods called aggregations, which each nest looks like a little anthill. You can see it here, the tan-colored mounds of soil. And each nest is this tan-colored sand, and it's not an anthill because the entrance is about the width of a pencil, whereas an ant entrance would be about the width of a piece of capellini, angel hair pasta, to continue our pasta analogies. Now, how does a bee remember which nest hole is hers? They all look the same and they're all clustered together. Well, a bee sees the world very differently than we do. And while we primarily use vision to locate our way home, or we put a number on our mailbox, bees smell their way home. She marks the sand around her entrance with a unique pheromone that distinguishes her nest from her neighbors. And you can really ruin a bee's day if you go up and you mess the sand up around her nest entrance. She will be very confused, but not completely. And she uses a variety of visual cues as well to remember her way home. So as I'm walking around here and exploring, I take extra care not to disturb the sand around her entrance, because that's equivalent to like me taking up a mailbox and moving it to my neighbor's house and swapping those mailboxes to confuse, which should be a very rude thing to do. So once she leaves her nest entrance, she remembers where it is. She's marked it with her pheromone. She flies to get food at the grocery store. Now, for a bee, the grocery store is the canopy. She goes up into the red maple blooms, and she just has a royal time up there. She is drinking nectar. She is getting pollen. She is getting pollen all over her body. Now, she can't really help it. Imagine trying to dip your hand into a bag of Doritos or a bag of Cheetos and not get any Cheeto dust on your hand. That's what it's like for a bee visiting the maple flowers. The pollen is statically charged, and so it literally leaps off of the anthers and onto her hairs. She gathers, she drinks nectar, and she actually packs some of this pollen into specialized hairs on her legs, known as scopal hairs. And these hairs are very branched, and they're excellent at transporting pollen. She flies back down into the nest to what's known as a brood cell. The brood cell she prepared the night before. She mixed saliva with the secretion from her abdomen, and she painted it along the inside of the soil to make a waterproof nursery for her baby. She regurgitates nectar, churns it with pollen, and she makes a soup-like consistency that's very nutritious. She'll dangle an egg from the ceiling of the nursery, seal it off with more cellophane, and that is all of the care that that baby bee will get. But it's a lot of care. She spent a full day of her life preparing the nursery, gathering food. In contrast, a monarch butterfly will lay an egg on a single milkweed leaf in about 5 seconds. And the monarch can lay about 700 eggs in her life, but she can't give the care that a mother bee gives to her offspring. So all in all, a female cellophane bee might lay anywhere from 5 to 10 offspring, given, depending on how many flowers are around and how good the weather is. Now, this is all good and true, but there are insects that seek to disturb some of these provisions that the mother bee has left behind. This is a blister beetle, an insect whose entire life revolves around the life cycle of the cellophane bee. The blister beetle emerges in spring around the time of the male bees, and they don't fly, they don't eat. The males and female beetles mate, and the female beetle lays a bunch of eggs in the sand on the surface. The eggs hatch into larvae, and the aim of these larvae is to get down into a brood cell to feast on the nutritious pollen and nectar. But these beetle larvae are not, they are slightly mobile, but they are not, marathoners here. How is a beetle larva supposed to get down into the nest? How is it even supposed to find the nest? The beetle larvae smell irresistible to a male bee, and the male bee attempts to mate with the ball of larvae. The larvae hop onto the male bee's back, and the male bee, rightfully sort of realizes his error. But he's zealous, it's spring, and love is in the air, and he attempts to find a female to mate with. When the male bee mates with an actual female bee, those larvae hop off of their first ride and onto the second, and now the larvae are right where they want to be. They're on the back of a female bee that's returning to her nest. The female bee scurries down, carrying the beetle larvae, and into the nest they go. She puts the pollen and nectar down, the larvae hop off, and she's sealed inside a killer. The beetle larvae kill the host bee egg, they kill each other until just one remains, and that winning beetle larva feasts on the pollen provisions. Now, I know what you might be thinking, like, why do we like the beetle? We like bees. Why do we care about the beetle? The beetle is evil. And I'm just going to push back against those temptations. It's really easy to malign beetles. But for one, the beetle's entire life cycle revolves around this cellophane bee. There is no beetle without bee. The beetle is also an important part of our local biodiversity. And so when we say we want to save bees, it's not just the individual species. It's the plants that those bees pollinate, but it's also the predators and the other associations that those bees have with other animals. And so saving cellophane bees is as much about the bee as it is about the red maple, as it is about the blister beetle. Plus, we all love nature documentaries, and who doesn't love the story of the gazelle evading the lion? But also, we all love the story of the lion hunting the gazelle. The same thing is unfolding here, right? We can tell the story from the cellophane bee's perspective, or we can tell it from the blister beetle's perspective. And it's precisely these stories that I just get so excited about because they're happening all around us. I'll continue to tell stories of bees and plants and the animals they interact with. So it's like late May in Boston, and the cellophane bee aggregation has died down. I'll go down there, I'll eat a sandwich for lunch, and 2 feet beneath my feet, bees are having their lunch. The larvae, and maybe the beetle larvae, are munching on pollen and nectar, waiting to develop. They develop into adults by September, but rather than emerge, they wait and they hibernate underground until the following spring. And this is because, well, one, there's not enough time left in the season to complete a generation, but also their favorite flowers aren't in bloom yet. The red maples and the fruit trees won't be in bloom until the following year. And so they'll come back 1 year later at the end of March, and I'll be there to see them. And I encourage you, if you have an idea of where a sandy lakeshore might be, or even like a dry slope in a cemetery, you can go out in March and April and spot these cellophane bees for yourselves. Not all bees live below ground. Some bees live above ground, and they come in a few flavors. There's the renters, there's the excavators, and there's the architects. We're going to talk about the renters and excavators today. So by renter, I mean that instead of digging a tunnel underground, they find a pre-existing cavity above ground. And one of our best known renters are the mason bees, Osmia lignaria. The females emerge in spring around the time of the cellophane bees, but rather than go to maples, they go to fruit trees like apples and pears and cherries. Their favorite flowers are in that rose family. And the females gather pollen and nectar to make a similar bee bread. But rather than build the brood cells out of cellophane, like our cellophane bees, the mason bees build it out of mud. And so in addition to needing flowers and a place to nest, our mason bees need a source of mud. Now imagine my surprise a few years ago when I was walking down the street and I saw probably like no fewer than 30 metallic blue bees flying into a muddy bank. I was like, what the heck is going on? You know, you read about mason bees gathering mud, but no one describes what it actually looks like. I mean, there was like a plastic drainage pipe jutting out from this bank and a bunch of bees hovering around it. And as I got in closer, I snapped this photograph of this female mason bee with a little BB-sized ball of mud that she had smoothed and polished and was gathering to bring back to her nest. And so on the bottom here, you can see what that nest she builds looks like. Starting on the left side, we see there's a cocoon with a mud wall separating each of the babies. But other renters employ different building materials. Some of them gather tree sap to line their nests, such as the resin bees. And other bees use leaves to line their nests, such as the leafcutter bees. Now you can look for clues that leafcutter bees are in your garden. They cut little discs out of the margin of leaves, particularly those in the rose and the pea family, like this redbud leaf. Now, this is not some weird variety of Swiss cheese redbud. This is a healthy redbud leaf with the evidence that a leafcutter bee has cut out discs from the margins of the leaf, never the center. And so the bees have their favorite leaves, and she'll come back repeatedly within the hour to gather little discs. This doesn't hurt your plant any more than what happens aesthetically. Now, many of you might have heard of the concept of bee hotels, which are basically big arrays of pre-existing cavities designed to provide homes for these renter solitary bees. I don't have a lot of time to get into it. You feel free to ask me afterwards. I have some slides that I can share with y'all. Basically, I don't recommend bee hotels as a way of boosting our solitary bee populations. Oftentimes, good intentions can go awry, and these hotels can lead to a buildup of pathogens if not properly maintained. So while they're a great educational tool, I think there's other ways we can steward our gardens, which I'll go into in a bit, about how we can provide habitat for our solitary cavity nesting bees that doesn't require maintaining a bee hotel. Cavities are also vulnerable to parasites, maybe not our conniving beetles, but conniving wasps. These are leucospid wasps that aim to lay eggs within the nests of solitary bees. The female smells her way to a cavity and waits for the host female to leave. She slips inside, braces herself with her legs, and begins the process of sliding her ovipositor into a suitable brood cell. So on the right side here, we have a wasp that snuck in, is bracing herself on the side walls, and the ovipositor has extended out of the back of her abdomen. The ovipositor is an egg-laying organ. So this black line is her ovipositor, and she has bypassed this first cell and made it into the second cell. Now watch what happens in this second cell right here. Oh my God. Oh my God. It's like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Look at this. She's managed to not only lay an egg in a brood cell and slip past the brood cell partition, but she's also laid an egg in the brood cell that has already been completed, which means when the host bee comes back, there will be no way of removing the wasp egg because it's already been sealed up. Talk about an amazing adaptation of these wasps. So bees that don't live in pre-excavated cavities are known as excavators, our carpenter bees. And they come in two sizes. We have our big, gentle giants, the large carpenter bees, Xylocopa virginica. And we have our tiny, small carpenter bees, the Ceratina, that are metallic blue. So on the left here, we have our small carpenter bees that love excavating pith from plant stems like elderberry, as well as raspberry canes. So if you have raspberry canes in your garden, you can cut them to about 12 or 16 inches, and that'll expose the pithy stems that these carpenter bees love to nest in. You can see these bees on goldenrods and sunflowers late in the season. And you can see how in this nest on the bottom here, how their partitions of the nests are actually made of the excavated pith, not leaves, not resin, not mud, but actually the excavated pith. In contrast, I think many of us engage with the larger carpenter bees around our wooden decks or around the eaves of buildings. Carpenter bees like to chew wood, and historically they would live in dead snags, trees in our forests, but we often remove those dead trees, and the way we manage our forests don't really allow for those cavities to remain. And so the carpenter bees find, very adaptable of them, they find an alternative source of wood to nest in, which is our untreated lumber. So if this is posing jeopardizing the integrity of your deck and your safety is at risk, I encourage you to sort of resolve the matter. You can paint over the nest entrance to discourage them from nesting there in the future. You can plug it with steel wool or with caulk. And I encourage sort of non-toxic approaches with the idea that if it comes to it and your deck is about to fall over, you can eradicate them with sort of a target chemical, but ideally that's not what it comes to. These carpenter bees can build large galleries within your deck. Like, it's really hard work excavating all that wood, and so they don't go away from year to year. Many of our other native bees sort of move from site to site, including our bumblebees, but our carpenter bees will live in the location they've found for many years. Okay, so that sort of gives you a taste of how our different bees nest. What flowers do our native bees visit? So as I explained earlier, bees are vegans and vegetarians, right? Their entire diet comes from plants. Flower nectar is where their carbohydrates come from and their electrolytes, and pollen is their main source of protein. So when a bee is looking for nectar, not every flower is suitable. Some plants have very deep corollas, which is the distance between the entrance of the flower and the base of the flower where the nectar is produced. And so bees with very long tongues, like our bumblebees, are able to access nectar from plants with deep corollas. And you'll see them on this, for example, on this bee balm. In contrast, other plants have very short corollas, which is suitable for bees with short tongues, like this cute little masked bee here. And so you see these bees on very flat flowers, like flowering dogwood shrubs or Queen Anne's lace or wild parsnip, which have very flat flowers and are favored by bees with very short tongues. Bees also stock the pantry when they're on flowers by gathering pollen. You can see on our longhorn bee here, her back leg is really thick with hairs. These are the scopal hairs that are specially adapted for carrying pollen back to the nest. And pollen is incredibly protein rich. It can be up to 60% or more, which is the energy that those bees need to develop into adults. All this pollen is hard work. When bees are getting pollen, they do a variety of maneuvers. They dance, they tap the flower, they scrabble around, and the bees want to make sure that all of their hard work is not lost in flight or it gets dislodged on a flower. And so a bee will store pollen in particular places on the body. Our leafcutter bees and our mason bees store pollen underneath their abdomens. Many of our solitary bees, like this green metallic agapostemon here, she stores pollen dry on her legs. And the bumblebees and honeybees actually mix some of that pollen with nectar to produce a shiny pellet and store that on their legs. Not all pollen is suitable. Plants are sort of in this battle with bees in the sense that they're producing pollen to go to other flowers, not into the nest of a bee. And so a plant will defend its pollen with chemicals that basically make it unpalatable to bee larvae. Well, a bee has co-evolved alongside our native plants, and some of them have evolved to eat and detoxify some of those chemicals. And so some of our native bees are very picky, and they have very particular diets that reflect that coevolution. We have sunflower bees that only eat the pollen from sunflowers. We have blueberry bees that only eat the pollen from blueberries, and we have goldenrod and aster bees that you only find gathering the pollen and nectar from goldenrods and asters. One of my favorite bees, specialist bees, lives in the garden, in the vegetable garden. It's early morning, 6:30, 7 a.m. The sun is up. It's going to be a hot day, but it's still sort of cool in that early morning shade. And the squash bees are out. The squash bees are zooming from flower to flower of zucchini and pumpkin and butternut squash, the big yellow ones. The males are looking for females. The females are dodging the males. And they're drinking the huge pools of nectar at the base of these flowers. And the females are just absolutely coated in the huge grains of pollen. You can even see some of these huge grains of pollen on this bee's body. The females, it gets hot in the afternoon. And if any of you have grown squash before, you'll know that the squash flowers close in the heat of the day. So they're open from pre-dawn to about noon, and then the squash flowers close. And when the squash flowers close, there's no more food for those bees. And so the females retire to their nests. Their nests are located nearby. Again, they sort of look like ant mounds, but they have an entrance about the width of a pencil. Meanwhile, the males have nowhere to go. They're not welcome in the nest. And so they take a siesta. And the males take a siesta inside the flowers. So I encourage you to go out at like 2 p.m. next summer and peel open the closed bloom of your zucchini or your pumpkin. And you'll find yourself face to face with a little slumber party of male bees. Now, don't worry, as I said earlier, male bees can't sting. So this is an incredibly safe activity. But one of my favorite parts of learning about bees is being able to predict and expect natural phenomena to occur. And this is something that I can almost say with certainty will be in your garden if you're growing squash in New England. What would a story about a bee be without another insect that tries to foil its plans? This is not just any insect. This is another bee, a cuckoo bee. The cuckoo bee's life revolves entirely around its host squash bee. The aim of this female is to get an egg inside of an opened brood cell. She waits for her opportunity, and when mama squash bee is out, the host cuckoo bee slips inside, wanders the dark corridors of the nest, lays an egg in a brood cell, and slips out undetected. When mama squash bee returns, she has no idea what transpired, and she goes on her merry way, sealing up the nest. This video here is of a cuckoo bee leaving the nest that she didn't build. She didn't gather the pollen. She didn't dig that tunnel. She's just gone inside and laid an egg inside the the brood cell. Mama squash bee's returned. She has no idea what just transpired, and she seals up the brood cell. And inside, she has locked a killer. The cuckoo bee larva hatches into a larva with huge jaws. The cuckoo bee larva slices the host bee in half. But remember, bees are vegans, would never eat the bee it just assassinated. And so then it develops on the nutritious pollen and nectar from squash all summer long until the following year when squash is blooming again and the squash bees are up. The cuckoo bee will emerge from the nest right in sync with its host. Now, the simple act of planting squash has led to squash bees, has led to cuckoo bees, and has also led to other animals interacting with that, like this crab spider that has just snagged a cuckoo bee on a flower. Crab spiders don't spin webs. They camouflage themselves and wait to ambush unsuspecting flower visitors. And so when we say we want to help squash bees, we plant squash, we help squash bees. Not only are we helping squash bees, but we're helping cuckoo bees, and we're helping crab spiders, and we're helping mockingbirds that eat the crab spiders, and we're helping Cooper's hawks that eat the mockingbirds that eat the crab spiders. And it's this simple act that can sort of propagate throughout our landscapes to sustain not just bees, but all of their interactions in the world. Which is to say is you can make a difference through your landscaping decisions. Our backyards and our gardens, as I think many of you are probably aware, can be habitat for bees and other pollinators. And what is a habitat but a home? And what is a home but something that gives us what we need? And so what do bees need? We just spent the last 40 minutes talking about what do bees need, with the idea that we might be able to make some decisions about how we can manage our lands for bees. I've come up with an acronym to help you remember. It's SEEDS. We can use seeds to save native bees, SEEDS. S stands for spread native flowers, the flowers that our native bees have co-evolved with and are used to, the ones that produce pollen that is their favorite, and the ones that produce nectar from flowers that they can access. The pollinator gardens here can take a variety of forms. They're simply an area that's been intentionally designed and planted with the needs of pollinators in mind. It can be a patch in your front yard. It can be a strip along the sidewalk. It could even be a project you work on with your neighbors to convert a highway or a road median into habitat. The two fundamentals of making a pollinator garden is that you ensure sequential native blooms across the growing season, and that you provide a diversity of flower shapes, colors, and sizes within that sequence. So this is the garden that I planted and maintained for 4 years at Tufts in Boston. And in early April, there's not much activity in our gardens. Most of the activity is up in the larger, older trees, like red maples. They're up in the trees. In May, the spring blooming trees and shrubs become key. These hawthorns are just absolutely vibrating with more than 10 species of bees that depend on plants in the rose family for nutrition. In June, the trees and the shrubs begin to fade. We have some spirea off to the side, but our foxglove beard tongues and our phlox begin to attract the early season bees. In July, our garden is beginning to have a greater diversity of colors, forms, and sizes, like these candelabras of Culver's fruit and the big sort of fountains of Joe Pye weed and bee balm. In August, the garden is just absolutely out of control. We've got yellow sunflowers, and we have stilphium, and we have goldenrods, and ironweed, which supports its own specialist bee. And this is, I mean, we can see upwards of 30 to 40 insect species within just, a few cars length of a garden. In September, our garden is still pumping out pollen and nectar, not only for the bees that are living within this garden, but migrating insects like monarch butterflies stop over at our gardens to fuel up. And even into October, our garden continues to provide abundance, not flowers with pollen and nectar, but the products of those flowers, fruits and seeds that migrating birds like palm warblers and chipping sparrows depend on to make their migration south of Massachusetts, where it's too cold, into the mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. We leave our garden sort of looking with all this vegetation to ensure that insects that are in the leaf litter or on the side don't get swept away with the compost. Winter is a wonderful time for reflection, and I know you all on the Pollinator Pathway has a wonderful collection of local sources in New England of where to get seeds and plants to provide this garden. But here are a few others of my favorites that I've visited and enjoyed working with. What would a talk about gardening be without Nick's picks? So here are 8 sort of herbaceous perennials that I like for bees because they exemplify these fundamentals. You know, all the way from early in the season with lance-leaf coreopsis to the end of the season with goldenrods and asters, we've covered aim number 1, which is to provide season-long blooms. We've also hit aim number 2 because we're providing a diversity of flowers, some that look like suns, others that look like little bells, others that look like trumpets, others that look like purple fountains of ironweed and yellow fountains like goldenrods. Now, many of these plants also go supporting those specialist bees, the ones that are very picky. Early season aster specialists love coreopsis. Late season aster specialists like ironweed and sunflowers and asters. But what if you don't have a sunny area where many of these plants thrive? Don't worry, got you covered with shade-tolerant blooms. We've got geraniums in spring and golden alexanders, each of which support picky specialist bees. Even dogwood has 3 different species of specialist bees in New England that depend on shrubby dogwoods like red osier dogwood or gray dogwood. If you've never seen black cohosh before, it's just a stunning plant. It has these sort of big dark green leaves at the base and 4 or 5 foot tall spikes of white flowers that just sort of blow around in the understory. Great blue lobelia and cutleaf coneflower, sort of the end of summer. And then there are shade-tolerant asters and goldenrods for your needs. But what about the early spring bees, Nick? You said you started with coreopsis, which doesn't bloom until May. I know that many of you just said that. Well, I got you covered. Trees and shrubs that bloom in March, April, and May for our bees to cover that early season. Red maples are great choices. There are many willow specialist bees. Eastern redbud and tulip trees, the tulip poplar, are just, I mean, look at this, just a chalice of nectar up in the canopy. You can't do much better than black cherry or other relatives in the genus Prunus, like beach plums, and chokeberry, like Aronia. Highbush blueberries, meadow sweet, crab apples. If you're planting 1 or 2 of these on your landscape, you're going a long way to supporting many, many, many of our native bees. Now, if you can't find some of these or you want to go to just sort of your local nursery, there are a few tips that I can provide for navigating the sort of onslaught of cultivars and types of plants that you find at a nursery. The first is the best litmus test is when you're picking out a flower at a nursery, look for plants that are in bloom and see if there's any insects on the flowers. Some plants, when humans modify them to, we breed them for our own preferences, we incidentally breed out traits that insects like. For example, this wild type sunflower has been bred to have a lot of petals, which basically makes it physically impossible to access any of the pollen and nectar that's left. And in fact, many cases, the pollen and nectar is bred out in the process. Have you ever seen seeds for pollenless sunflowers that don't sort of shed pollen over your kitchen table? Know that growing those means that there's no pollen for bees that like sunflower pollen. So my recommendation is 1, look for what flowers in bloom at the nursery have insects on them. And 2, if you can, just choose the wild type, the one that hasn't been bred. You know it's been bred if it has sort of a fun name after it in single quotes, like teddy bear. The other thing is to be very skeptical of great for pollinator advertising. You can go to big box stores like Home Depot and see big displays, help the pollinators. And they have sort of cheap $10 seed mixes that you might be able to spread over a front lawn strip. I don't recommend these at all. They are often filled with exotic, invasive plants, and plants that actually don't go a long way to supporting the diversity of bloom times and the diversity of flower structures that our insects need. Yes, you might attract a lot of honeybees and maybe some very, very common bees and other pollinators, but they aren't designed with the needs of our local bees in mind. And so I encourage you to leave this on the shelf and instead use some of the advice earlier in this presentation to guide your decisions. The second letter in seeds is E, employ a life cycle approach. We were talking about earlier is all these needs of the insects when they're not active. And so one of the easiest things you can do to ensure those needs are met is simply don't clean up your garden as much. We have this practice of taking away every little bit of litter and shipping it off to some facility. Why? Why not leave some of that biomass where it falls? That'll not only reintroduce nutrients into the soil, but it provides cover and shelter for a lot of our pollinators. For example, when we were talking about bumblebees, we learned about what these bumblebees need throughout their life cycle. Spots to nest, which is often undisturbed sort of vegetation on the sides of rock walls, or even just adding structure to your landscape like a shrub. Bumblebees might be able to nest at the base of that shrub. And queens, when they're trying to find places to hibernate, often tuck beneath leaf litter. Well, if there's no leaves left because we shipped them all off, then there's no places for bumblebees to spend the winter. Leaving leaves and leaving debris doesn't mean leaving a mess. You can still make a tidy garden and make it relevant for these other life stages. So one strategy would be to rake leaves over to the sides of your lawn or onto your bed in just a 2-inch layer. You leave it on the lawn, it'll start to sort of decompose and rot, and it might make it unsightly. And so raking it over to the side is great. Don't shred the leaves, because that's shredding the insects that are inside the leaves. If this is a new idea to you, I encourage you to use a trial area. Maybe only put 1/10 of your garden in this mode, and maybe mark it off with rope so you remember, oh yes, this is my trial area where I'm making a decision intentionally for insects, and I want to see if I like this new aesthetic. You don't have to do it all or nothing. One of the, you can wait to clean up your yard until, the rule of thumb I usually give is about May 1st, which is when the temperatures are usually warm enough for many of those insects to emerge. However, that advice is not true across the board, because there are some insects who have depend on leaf litter for multiple years, and which is why the general advice of just simply clean up less is usually best. So stems in your garden can be homes for those renter bees, like our leafcutter bees. But you need to leave the stems standing for 3 years in order for it to be effective. So year 1, the plant grows, and you cut the stems back. They're about 8 to 12 inches in height. Those stems are hollow or pithy, depending on our renter or our excavator. The second growing season, bees will build nests in those cut stems, and new stems will grow from the base of the plant past those hollow stems. You leave those stems from the first year still standing, because now there's a nest of bees in them that won't emerge until the following year. The following growing season, the bees emerge from those cut stems and commence their life cycles. And so you see why there's like no good way of sort of cutting them down strategically. If you cut a stem down for a bee, you got to leave it standing for 2 years. And so that's why a trial garden might be an easier way of sort of integrating some of these ideas into your landscape. The second E in seeds is really quite simple: eliminate pesticides. What kills a mosquito, what is advertised as being bad for mosquitoes, inevitably is bad for bees. And if you don't have a landscape, please go out and vote for stricter legislation. And the same applies to herbicides and fungicides that can't possibly be good for the insects that live on our landscape. So this is like a really straightforward piece of advice. And yeah, I have nothing more to say other than please spray less. And if you're not spraying, then kudos. D is my favorite part. This is discover what's around you. This is what catalyzed my shift from being terrified of insects for about 20 years to being just an advocate for them. Discovering what's around you means making a practice of going out and paying attention to the insects that are in your yard. You know, it doesn't have to be long, 2-3 minutes a day or once a week can really shift our understanding and our appreciation for the bees in their lives. Many of the things that I shared today came out of simply going out and watching bees, as I call it. And I think if ultimately we're going to catalyze a broader shift in how we steward our landscapes, it's not just enough to care about insect declines. We have to care about the insects we're trying to help. And as poet Mary Oliver says so wonderfully, that attention is the beginning of devotion. And, at the end of the day, it's all about caring about these insects. And that is the motivation for so much of this work. And the way to get to that care is through attention. So I encourage you to go bee watching. I've written a guide with my good friend and colleague, Max McCarthy, to help you learn about the bees in your yard. It's called watchingbees.com. We cover 50 different species that live in your backyard, and we focus on what you can see through a phone camera or through binoculars. I recommend these Papilio Pentax binoculars. It's not about a microscope. It's not about hard to see details. It's about what a bee is doing on a flower and what it looks like to you in the garden. As a way of helping to catalyze some of this attentiveness to the natural world. Some of the native bees that you might be able to see in your yard this year are the bicolored striped sweat bee, which is always found on purple coneflower echinacea right around the end of June. They're bright green with a black and white abdomen. You can also see bees that are entirely black with often yellow or orange pollen on their hind legs. These bees love garden plants. You'll find them around the squash. They like flowering corn. They also love zinnias and this portulaca and bee balm. And then, of course, our bumblebees, which I encourage you to just stop and notice and watch and maybe listen for that sonication on flowers, or if you grow tomatoes in your garden, you can hear that buzz pollination. If you're really into this stuff, I teach a course every summer with Max up at Eagle Hill Institute, just north of Bar Harbor in Maine. And we dig in for 5 days with 15 other students to learn about how to identify bees and learn more about their ecology and identification. And then the last letter of seeds is to share with others. And I think the pollinator pathway really embodies this, right? It's all about connecting people. I mean, we have over 300 people tonight. And if you can take something that you've learned here and share it with a neighbor or a family member to sort of spread the word, then you've done just an amazing, amazing job. And it's what we need here. This is, if we think about conservation happening on big natural lands, it's all about sort of top-down legislation or management plans. And for one of the first times, community members, general public is being engaged as agents and catalysts for biodiversity conservation from the bottom up. This is an incredible grassroots movement that you all are a part of, and it just keeps growing every single year. And I'm excited to be a part of it. I'm excited you all are part of it. And so spreading the word is what needs to happen as well. I'm almost done. I just want to leave you with a takeaway, which is that I invite you all to slow down, and pay attention and listen carefully to your garden this coming year. I think many of you as gardeners have probably paid attention to the plants for many years and maybe noted conspicuous butterfly. But I'm also going to encourage you to pay attention and notice the bees in your garden this year. From these observations, we can learn to steward our gardens with the knowledge of those who live in it. And by extension, we learn about ourselves and the places that we live. You know, natural history and the observing bees is not called history for no reason, right? History repeats itself every year. And every year, the same bees come out in our gardens, and the same bees are on their favorite flowers. And what better way of keeping track of environmental change and the impact that we're having on our landscapes than by keeping track of those patterns? And when we do those things, we learn that our native bees don't need much to stay around. They need what I call small, intentional, repeatable actions. Things like planting their favorite flowers throughout the year because we know what flowers they like. Things like telling the pesticide company we're not interested because we like the insects on our property. Or teaching a child that bees should be revered and not feared because it's the bees that give us the food that help us grow strong. Which means at the end of the day, each and every one of us has the agency to keep our forests full of Andrena aerugeniae, our old fields full of Bombus viridis, our pine barrens teeming with Caletes validus, our meadows teeming with Andrena nubecula, our headlands with Hebropoda laboriosa, our wetlands full of Duphoria noviangliae, our dunes full of Caletes speculiferus, and our gardens and our backyards full of Agapostum virescens and so many others, all of which can spark wonder in the natural world and have us cultivate empathy for non-human individuals and help us grow a more livable and sustainable future. So I appreciate all of your attention tonight. Excited for our question and answer session, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Nick, thank you so much. I almost forgot to turn my video on. I was just so into this. You've gotten us so excited because of your enthusiasm. And I know I'm speaking for more than just myself. I can't wait until spring comes. The best part about the garden is crawling around on my hands and knees and looking for anything I can find. And now I know what I'm going to be looking at. So it's really wonderful. We have a few questions. And those of you who are going to stay on for a little bit longer, if you do want to, we're still going to take some more questions here. Nick has agreed to stay on for a few minutes. And so it looks like the first question goes back to kind of the beginning of your talk. Someone has asked for the explanation of why cellophane bees are called cellophane bees.
Yeah, so they get their name from that waterproof lining that their brood cells are made out of. It's sort of translucent, and to the entomologist that described them, sort of was reminiscent of cellophane. They also go by the name of silk bees or polyester bees. I find the name cellophane bee to be much more evocative, and so.
Question number: how does mulching affect bees that nest in the ground? And will a light layer of chopped leaves or wood chips discourage ground nesting?
That's a great question. So some bees require bare soil, and other bees actually have no problem digging through sort of a light layer of mulch. And so when it comes to this, my recommendation is sort of go for diversity and maybe leave some bare patches in your garden that don't have mulch on them and mulch other areas. And it can even be as small as sort of like a little strip around the edge of your bed that is bare. And you can mulch the bases of your plants so that they don't have to be watered as much. So just like aim for a diversity of flower types, aim for a diversity of nesting surfaces.
Somebody's asking, you mentioned planting in medians and around highways. This person, having read Crossings by Ben Goldfarb, understands that there are pretty significant negatives to putting habitat next to roads. How do you balance this?
It's a great question. So the first thing I say is there's still a lot we're learning about the relationship between insects and roads. And as you drive along roads, you know that so many insects get splattered by cars. When I made that comment, thank you for clarifying, I was sort of talking about sort of not necessarily big interstates, but sort of along the edges of more residential roads. There is a lot of interest in planting highway medians for bees. And I think the best course of action is actually planting the edges of the roads rather than planting in the middle of the road, right? So we plant in between two 4-lane highways. There's a good chance that bees going to and from are going to get hit. But keeping habitat on the sides of the roads seems to be something that the recent research, including some that I've done on bee movement, suggests that bees will take advantage of habitat on the sides of roads.
What is the name of the bee binoculars you mentioned? I think someone must have missed that.
Yeah, so the name is, I can even put it in the chat.
Okay.
It's the Papilio pentax. Is the Papilio pentax. And if you go to watchingbees.com, we have a whole equipment list of how you can, go bee watching.
I can't wait. Does deer spray impact bees?
I'm not familiar with deer spray. I'm not sure what's in it. Yeah, I guess I can't speak to that. If it's sort of a chemical insecticide or pesticide, I suspect it's probably not great.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't speak to that.
Molly Jacobson asked if your Calides validus research has been published yet.
Hi, Molly. I know Molly. She's also a bee scientist in New England. It's funny you ask. No, it's not published yet. I was actually working on it earlier today, so stay tuned. The sneak peek is that so I described how cellophane bees take 1 year to develop. They go, from an egg laid in April to an adult the following April. Well, it turns out that that's only half the story, and that some cellophane bees enter dormancy for an extra year. They put the pause on, and they don't emerge until 2 years after they've been laid. And so my research was thinking about, well, why do this? Why delay emergence? And we're all familiar with the financial advice to not put all your eggs in one basket and diversify your stock portfolios. What if a bee is diversifying its nest portfolio and gaining benefits in case next year is a poor year with no flowers? It might be good to take out an insurance policy.
Oh.
And so that's the sort of stuff I've been thinking about, which all came out of observations that no one else knew about. This was not something that was known about these bees 5 years ago. And that is something that motivates me to continue being a scientist, is the ability to contribute some of these cool secrets. So stay tuned.
Amazing. How did you get the video of the ovipositor laying the egg? Absolutely incredible.
So I actually can't take credit for that. That is a friend that lives in the UK took that. But I can tell you, these hotels, these bee hotels, are produced by this company called Rivajam, and they open up like a book. So on the right here, we have something that you can hang up on the side of your house, and instead of it just being a cavity, you open it up and it's plexiglass on either side. And so you get a glimpse into what these bees are building, who's home, and what they're doing in there. And so that video was taken through a hinged bee hotel with plexiglass. You can get them for like $40 on Amazon. And I advocate for them as an educational tool. This is not going to be the panacea for bees, but it might be something that sparks curiosity in a kid or makes you more excited to plant flowers for the bees that are in your hotel.
Amazing. Is there a brand name that?
Yeah, the the brand name is Rivajam. It's like one of 3 products they make.
Okay, great, thanks. Has bee pollen been developed to fit with the different hair patterns on bees? I know all pollens differ from plant to plant, but did they evolve their nooks and crannies to fit with the bees that pollinate those flowers?
They evolved alongside each other. So yes, so bee hairs have, the bee hairs on their legs have a certain amount of branching and a certain amount of spacing to accommodate the size of that pollen and the way that pollen is presented, the time of day it's presented, and how sticky that pollen is corresponds to the insect that it's best transports it. So for example, our squash bee example, squash pollen is really big. And as a result, squash bees have hairs on their legs that are really widely spaced apart to accommodate those grains.
Great. So being wary of time here, I'm going to ask one last question. How do you feel about planting along sidewalks when there could be people with bee allergies?
That's a really important consideration. So in general, when bees are at the grocery store, at the flowers, they're very gentle. And that's not where antagonistic interactions are going to take place. If somebody grabs a flower and the bee is in their hand, probably going to get stung. And so things that you can do to reduce the likelihood of that interaction is you could have like a layer of mulch or rocks that set the flowers slightly back from the sidewalk. You could have a little rope so people understand that please don't touch the flowers. You could even have a sign that say, bees are gentle, but please give them the space. They're, gathering food. So I think a combination of planting flowers, but then also providing signage to inform people as they're passing by.
I'm going to squeeze in one last question because actually it's one that I want to know the answer to, or at least hear what you have to say about it. Are honeybees a direct threat to native bees, and is the competition really a problem?
So the research on competition between honeybees and native bees is still emerging, and it's something that scientists are really interested in right now. In general, the thought is that adding 30,000 honeybees to the landscape definitely poses competition threats to our native bees. In addition, honeybees can vector diseases and pathogens that can transfer between species. So it's not just a matter of honeybee to honeybee transmission, but honeybees can harbor bumblebee viruses and vice versa. And so the threat of adding a honeybee colony to the landscape can be greater than simply just raising it in your backyard, right? Like unlike backyard chickens, honeybees leave your backyard and they visit all sorts of flowers, including potential natural areas. And so while if you love keeping honeybees and you like the honey, that's a decision that you're welcome to make. My advice for like land trusts or nature preserves that want to help pollinators is to definitely say no to adding honeybee hives. It's a really easy action that can make a big difference. Leave those wild spaces for our native bees.
Well, this has been fantastic. We've had so many enthusiastic thank yous for your time tonight. And we will be sending out the recording to everybody that signed up. And I'm sure they're going to watch it over and over and over again, especially when spring arrives and they want to start to know what they saw. They can just watch your video. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm just so excited for the pollinator pathway and everybody that is joining us. And as somebody said at a meeting about a week ago, we're like a tribe. We're all coming together and we're really working to do the right thing for our backyards and for pollinators and for the environment. So thank you so much. And Nick, we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much, Donna, and thank you everyone for attending tonight.
Thank you.